Welcome to Maine Voices Livestream. Before we begin, some messages from our sponsors.
Hey, Maine. How are you? Yes, you. How are you really? It's a question we rarely ask ourselves. But to Northern Light Health, how you are means a lot. So we're out here asking and encouraging you to ask the people in your life, starting with yourself. So ask away. Then connect with us at northernlighthealth.org/howareyou.
The Portland area's trusted choice for senior living, Stroudwater Lodge, gives Maine seniors independence and families peace of mind. Residents enjoy chef-prepared meals, unique programming like beer brewing or classes led by local artists, along with all the maintenance-free benefits of community living. With their sister community, Avita, specializing in memory care on the same campus, Maine families have a wide variety of care options in a beautiful wooded setting, yet minutes from downtown Portland. To learn more, visit stroudwaterlodge.com.
Well, now we'll turn things over to DJ Martin.
Good evening and welcome to Maine Voices Live. My name is DJ Martin. I'm the Director of Advertising for the Portland Press Herald. We are thrilled to have author Morgan Talty as our final 2022 Maine Voices Live guest. Tonight, he'll be interviewed by staff writer Eric Russell. This summer, Morgan published Night of the Living Rez, a collection of stories about what it means to be Penobscot in the 21st century and what it means to live, to survive, and to persevere after tragedy. If you haven't read it already, you can find a link to purchase your copy in the chat. Before I turn it over to Eric, I wanted to thank our series sponsors, Stroudwater Lodge, Hub Furniture, and our presenting sponsor, Northern Light Health. This event and the important local journalism we produce each day is made possible by our sponsors, advertisers, and you, our readers. Now is the perfect time to give the gift of knowledge, insight, and crossword puzzles with a gift subscription to the Press Herald. With our print and digital options, I'm sure you will find the perfect option for your friends, family, or just yourself. You'll find a link with the details in the chat at pressherald.com/gift. Without further ado, please welcome to the virtual stage, Eric Russell and Morgan Talty.
Thanks so much, DJ, and thanks to everybody for tuning in, and thanks, of course, to Morgan for participating. You guys may not know, but Morgan is in high demand right now. He's hard to get, and the reason he's hard to get is because everybody wants to talk about his book. So I'm excited to have this opportunity. Thank you, Morgan.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, and thank you, DJ. It's great to be here tonight.
You know, you and I spoke when I did a story ahead of your publication of your book back in the late spring, and a lot has happened since then. And I don't know if you had sort of expectations about how you thought the book might be received, but talk a little bit about what your life has been like over the last couple of months since the book's come out.
It's been good. A lot of emails, a lot of people reading. I had my website redone, and I had like a get in touch type thing. So I get a lot of like form emails from people asking if I could do readings or if I could come to book clubs, and I started saying yes to everything, and then it got to the point where I was like, this is impossible to do all of these things. But it's been really great. I mean, it's been fun. I've met so many wonderful people, so many wonderful readers, human beings. And just I get notes from people all the time telling me how much they love my book. I haven't gotten a bad email yet. I'm like waiting for one. I'm like hoping one will come because I find those to be really cool. I look at bad reviews and those are always funny. But no negative emails. But it's been great since the release of the book, and it keeps going up. Just when I think it's gonna like quiet down, it doesn't.
It seems like it's been showing up on every best of 22 list. I know you won a regional award for it, and it keeps kind of, as you said, building. Did you expect this to happen? I know you were feeling good about it, and you were feeling good about what you put out, and everything came together. But having this be your first, I mean, you've been published in magazines and other places, but in book length form, this was a first for you. So maybe you didn't have any expectations at all, but certainly it's got to have exceeded anything that was in your head.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, you know, it's hard, story collections are hard to, one, they're hard to sell. Two, I asked a group of people once, I was like, how many of you have read a story collection in the past, however long? And nobody really raised their hand. Most people, when they think of like books, they think of novels. They think of, a story that spans a long, range of pages. And so I didn't really, I didn't know what was going to happen with the book, and, it being, a story collection. I think it being a linked story collection helped a little bit too. I think also, some of the topics and themes I think were a bit exigent as well. And yeah, it just sort of caught me by surprise in a way.
Has there been one like author, fellow author, or notable person who reached out in one of these emails or notes where you were like, "Whoa, this is crazy"?
Um, so the person didn't reach out. I actually, I actually reached out to them, but like for a different reason, but inadvertently found out that they were a huge fan of my book. And that is the short story writer Karen Russell, who is just phenomenal. And when I was in Portland, Oregon, teaching at the Tin House workshop, and also there for the Portland Book Festival, I was able to meet her, and we got coffee and hung out for like 2.5 hours in a coffee shop, and it was very, very cool. And I just never thought in my life I'd be sitting with Karen Russell talking about books and stuff.
As you think about the reception and sort of the reviews that you've read, and if you've come across a negative one, let me know, because I haven't seen any for sure. But what are you seeing most about your book and why it's been so resonant with readers?
I feel like it really has resonated with people because there's something familiar about it for them. Even if they're not native, even if they themselves haven't struggled with, some of the struggles that the characters deal with. I think like for me, and I feel like we probably talked about this, back in May when we first met and chatted, but, I was very interested in writing obviously about, Penobscot, my background and stuff, but I was really interested in creating, human beings on the page. And I feel like that, I feel like that is a testament to, I feel like I accomplished that because so many people are able to relate with the book and with the people, because at the end of the day, that's what I really, really focused on, was like these characters, who they were. Like the universal thing that links us all together is our emotions. And I feel like I really tapped into that in a way that wasn't manipulative or exploitative. And so I to me, that seems to be the reason why readers are enjoy the book, is because they find part of themselves there, part of themselves in that universal, human experience.
How many people have asked you if it's autobiographical? I know you and I have talked about this, and it is a work of fiction, and it's a stated work of fiction, but certainly there was a lot that you drew from your own experiences, from things that you saw growing up, from people that you encountered. And so as you were trying to create, fictional characters, you also were drawing from real life people. And I wonder how you navigated that to create really indelible characters on the page.
Yeah, a lot of people ask that question, and they're like, what's real and what's not? And somebody also said to me at a reading, they're like, how come you didn't call this an essay collection, or like a memoir type thing? And, I gave examples as to why, but it's, for me, it was, I did draw from, experiences, but I chose fiction because fiction demands a particular, like the way we unveil truth or unravel truth is different in fiction than it is in nonfiction in some instances. And so it's all about, patterning stories and making them work in a specific way. And, I just found myself, I found myself writing, sometimes from a point of nonfiction, but hitting a point where I'm like, oh, this story would be so much better if, this had actually happened, right? And then changing the events, and then it's no longer nonfiction. At least you can't say so, or at least I couldn't say so ethically or morally, right? We know there are plenty of authors out there who do things like that. But yeah, so I mean, I drew from my experiences. I'm no stranger to the themes of these books, and some of the stories have like a breadcrumb of truth, like real stuff in it, and then the rest is nothing. It's pure fictional. Like Earth Speak, all of that is a fictionalized story, with the exception of the opening image of the fog hovering above the trees. Whereas the story Safe Harbor, where Dee is visiting his mom in a crisis stabilization unit, 2/3 of that story is pretty much, accurate. My mother used to go to places like that, and I'd visit with her. And then I invented the rest of the story. So, two wildly different examples, and then I think the rest are kind of like a mix of like me picking here and there with things and making a quilt, so to speak.
And what's the response been on Penobscot Nation? The book is set there. Certainly you grew up there. Have you had reception from folks who are still there or still really connected to that place?
Yeah, they've all have been nothing but they've given me nothing but support since the book has come out. And I was supposed to do a book signing there over the summer, but something happened and it got rescheduled, and I haven't done it, and I feel bad. And everyone keeps asking me when I'm going to do it, and now it's cold, so I'm like, I don't know when. But yeah, no, they've been fantastic. They've been supportive. They've been supportive now, but they've been supportive too before the book even came out. When I was writing stories, and when I was in school and all sorts of things, they've always been there cheering me on. And it was funny when the book first came out. For the first week and a half or something, I guess my aunt is a tribal clerk on the island, and for that week and a half, everybody kept going into her office asking her, being like, "So who's who in this book?"
Right.
They thought she had the answers as to who was who.
Have you gotten more of that over as the summer's gone on too? Did you base this character on me? That kind of stuff?
Not really. I think I've maybe been asked it just maybe a handful of times, and it's mostly been from like family members who've been curious. But I feel like most of the people are pretty sort of like, they're sort of what's the word? Amalgamations of like various people.
Were you most nervous about the reception among Indigenous people? I mean, was that sort of like the biggest like apprehension before this went live?
Yeah, I think it was. I think because like I didn't want, I spent so much time like making sure I didn't do certain things in the story collection that I felt, a lot of that some Indigenous writers have done in the past that have been kind of like questionable. And so I worried, I was like, in all my efforts to try to not do this, did I do it? Because you can only you can't tell, you get so close to something, you see it as it, as you're seeing it. And so that did worry me a little bit. But then I was kind of like, well, the book's coming out now. There's nothing I can do.
No turning back.
Yeah.
For those that don't know, this started as one singular short story back, several years ago that you wrote, and that I believe was published in a magazine. And then you had an idea. At what point did you have an idea to sort of do more that might fit in? I guess, how did it come about that you had these series of stories that were, could stand on their own, but were also interconnected in a way that could be a publishable book? Because as you said at the outset, I mean, it's not traditional. Certainly, it's something, and it's a hard sell for publishers and even for readers to pick up a book like this because they're so used to whether it's a nonfiction book or a straight novel, a fiction novel, and yours is something a little bit different. And so, how did you sort of figure out how this was going to work in terms of putting it all together?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. It was sort of by surprise along the way. I mean, I just, I set out in, I think, 2017 to write a story collection. And I'd had a handful, and I wrote a story collection that was very bad. Some of the stories were good, but the book just didn't work. And then I wrote the story Burn, which opens the story, not intending for it to be anything related to the book. But it turned out it was part of the book. That D in that chapter was David, and it reignited this whole, journey into writing. It reframed the entire way I saw the project. And so I started writing the D and Fella stories, not really knowing where I was going. There was no time markers with any of them. And I just kind of kept it was almost like a long hallway, and I just had like a candle, a dark long hallway, and I just had a candle. And it was like, if I step one foot in front, I can see a little bit ahead. And I just did that the whole way. Until finally I had just enough stuff where I was like, okay, now let's put it together and then chisel it and see what we're left with. So it was it was like a day by day type of thing. But that's not to say I didn't have goals in mind. I wanted it to be a story collection, but I also recognized its unique ability to function kind of like a novel. And so I kind of wanted to feed into both of those without breaking one or the other. And there's not too many out there like that I can think of. There's Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine, which originally, I believe when it first came out, was labeled as a novel and stories, but now it's strictly only labeled as a novel. And then there's Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad, which is, I think, it won the Pulitzer Prize, and I think they called it a collection of interconnected stories. And then there's Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son. And so those are I didn't frame the book off of any of those, but because there weren't very many books, but I think subconsciously my mind was okay, it can happen.
There's a template for it.
Yeah, and it's sort of, and I somehow managed to stumble into it.
You're clearly a student of writing, and now you teach writing as well. When was it just a love of reading yourself that you became a student of writing, or was it, figuring it out as a writer? I mean, how did you become so sort of cerebral about the process?
Well, I hated reading growing up. I hated it really badly. And then in high school, I wasn't the best student. I had a lot of things at home that impeded my ability to do well. And when I got to college, growing up, I'd always loved stories. I always loved telling stories. I just love storytelling. And when I got to college, there was space for me to fall in love with literature. There was nothing impeding my ability then. And I don't know, I kind of really liked it. And I was oh, well, I could do what I really, really love, and I can do it in this way. I could capture the story via fiction or nonfiction. And I just had teachers that were encouraging and were you should keep doing this. And I did. I just kept doing it. As for, my, I guess, deep interest in how writing works, is that I was also growing up, was really interested in magic, like magic tricks and stuff. And I remember watching the old David Blaine street magic videos and pausing it and watching it and trying to see how he did what he did with the cards. And I've always sort of compared that to literature, because a magician does a trick for you, and they you believe it. When they execute it well, you believe that something transcendental just occurred. And when you're writing a story, or when you read a book, and you read the book, and the writer has done almost sort of something like magic too. They have created a set of conditions in which you think you are actually there experiencing that story. So I always I noted that difference by the time I moved into literature. And so when I read books, I'm constantly asking myself, I'm all right, now how did the writer do this? So I'm always deeply interested in the mechanics. And sometimes I'll read a book and I'm I have no idea how they did this. And that's the purely magical stuff, right? That's for me, the best fiction is the stuff I can't figure out how it works.
One of the things I've noticed in your writing, so the details are very, it seems like they're very carefully chosen. You don't overload people with detail after detail after detail, but the details that are there are really important and really specific and really sort of, they only serve to advance the story. That's one thing that I thought a lot about. And the other thing that I thought a lot about is the dialogue. And dialogue can be either really, really good or just terrible in fiction. There's plenty of fiction that has just terrible, terrible dialogue. People don't talk like that, right? But yours is really, you can hear the characters, right? And I wanted to ask about how you developed an ear for that dialogue.
To be honest, I really think it comes back to like my having grown up and like my whole sort of like love of storytelling being this oral storytelling, right? Like hearing people talk, hearing how people tell stories, and also sort of just developing a deep sense of listening. When I was younger, like I was always, in social settings could be just very quiet, and just listening to the way people talk, the way they interact, the way they would like move, and talk and like engage in like whether they're cleaning something and talking. And I don't know, I just like always like to observe that stuff. And I think all of that ultimately just like kind of made it a little bit easier for me to work with dialogue. And I love dialogue. I love having characters talk. There's nothing more human, I don't think, in a story than actual people communicating to one another.
Yeah. There's an authenticity to it too. And I think that largely comes from, these people you're writing about, even though they're fictionalized versions of characters, these characters, what they are, what they represent, what their background is. And so there's an authenticity to all of these characters that's evident. Could you have done that if you didn't grow up in that environment?
I feel like if I didn't have the experiences I'd had, it probably would have been harder for me to write about the book in an authentic and true way without somehow summoning some type of connection to it. I think that's like the big thing is like when you write about a subject that's it's easy to write about a subject that's part of your experience, but it's hard to write about a subject that's outside of your experience. It's hard for two reasons. One, you might not write about it well enough. And two, people who have actually experienced it will look at it and be like, well, you're not doing that right. Or if you do it well, they're like, how dare you write about this? You don't know anything about, what I mean?
You're a fraud.
Yeah. So there's those things, so as a writer, I try to just respect, the spaces that I belong to, but then also the spaces I don't belong to. Right. And thinking about where basically my line is that I can cross or not cross into. Like, I feel like we, as artists, we're able to write about whatever we want, but like we have that right, but we have to sometimes ask, should we write about this particular thing? But yeah, so I don't know maybe it would have been maybe it would have been a very boring book of just people, I don't know, living a good, an okay life. I'm not sure.
Well, you touched upon it a little bit earlier that there's definitely some themes within these stories, and some themes show up multiple times, and they're dark. They're dark. I mean, there's a darkness to them. There's sadness, but it's not bleak, and that seemed like a real tough thing to pull off. Like, there's even within that darkness, there's like that humanity there, right? Like, and that really shone through. And I just wondered, how you wrestled with that, and was it a conscious decision to really make sure that like these weren't so depressing that people were just going to be like, oh my gosh, I don't think I can keep reading. Because I do think that even in the darkest of those stories, like there's that humanity that comes through, that people are still left with that feeling of like, of hope maybe.
Yeah, no, it was a conscious choice, and also maybe a subconscious one, just because, I grew up with an immense amount of love from people who, from my parents, from people who, struggled in the same way that these characters struggled. And so I think subconsciously I was able to do it. But then on the conscious level, I tried to look for moments like that to I think of Burn, for example, and we can read that as being funny, but there's also a very sad element to that story, right? And Dee gets Fellis home, and there's just this one line there where Dee goes, says something along, or says to himself, or the narrator says, I walked with him up the steps, but Phyllis walked fine by himself, but I still walked with him up the steps. And it was about like, like that was one of those moments where I consciously was like, I need to have these characters care for one another. Like they can't just like it can't, like they have to be there. They have to be in some way emotionally engaged, in this physical way, whether it's like a touch, whether it's a gesture of getting a drink, whether it's, something. And it's those tiny things. It's those like tiny things over the culmination of a person's life that, along with the immense love we have, I think that balance out, the terrible things we do experience.
When you and I spoke before, we talked a little bit about how Indigenous people for decades and decades and decades, more than that, have really been seen through the lens of Western culture, of a white culture, and often in stereotypical ways. And I know that one of the things you did deliberately was, these are Indigenous people characters, but they're just people. They're not meant to be anything other than just people. So you're not drawing attention to any sort of stereotypes or anything that, people might associate with that particular culture. And, I know you and I spoke a little bit about like, that was a balancing act too, because you're wanting to, provide representation, which has been really lacking for that community in books, in films, in any number of media. So you wanted to give representation, but you also didn't want to, play into some of these long held stereotypes. And I wonder how you maybe talk a little bit about how you navigated some of that.
Yeah. So I always made sure not to position any real cultural elements. Like I didn't try to use any cultural elements as props, as like objects through which I could create an emotional connection with the reader. Like I didn't want to do that. Like I wanted the emotional connection to come vis-a-vis the character and the reader. And also maybe with objects too, because that's how it works in fiction, emotion can transfer that way. But, I was very, I didn't, whenever there was a cultural, like, I didn't set out to be like, oh, in this story, I got to make sure, the Penobscot language gets used, on every page, I have to make sure there's, some, Penobscot story here, I have to make sure. I didn't look to check boxes, but rather, as I was writing these stories, I looked for opportunities where those cultural elements could seemingly just fit in and exist as part of the world, right? Instead of forcing them there, right? And being like, oh, let's throw this in just to, get a little, dazzle going about what it means, a Penobscot experience. And so there could have been so much stuff that I probably could, like if I wanted to have a box and like check it off, there could have been like so much more Penobscotness to the book. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't interested in exploiting it in that way and giving it away to readers for whatever purpose. I was just interested in these characters, and I think my intense focus on them as being human, but also being Indigenous, I think just sort of helped guide me.
Yeah. Do you think, there is better representation now? I mean, are we getting to a place where we're starting to have the right conversations about representation, whether it's in literature or in movies or in film or TV shows or music or things like that, and what's missing in that conversation?
Yeah, I think we are definitely on the right path. I feel like it'll be interesting within the next 10 to 15 years to see what type of works produced by Indigenous people, both in literature and, TV and film and music, all sorts of things. And I feel like we're having the right conversations. I feel like, the public and private spheres are doing a better job of having inclusivity, and bringing in disparate voices. I think the one thing that is perhaps lacking is that a lot of the institutions, I think that, get these conversations going, these institutions are predominantly non-native, right? They're led by non-natives. They're sort of like, it's the non-natives who can sometimes, it's in their hands who they pick to lead a particular program, right? And so I think that's the thing that's sort of missing, is it's like this power dynamic, because it's like, who has the power to dictate the path we go on? And I don't think that's been balanced out yet, and I wonder when it will be.
You talked, I know you spent time at Stone Coast, and I don't know if a lot of our readers, viewers know about Stone Coast. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that experience, how you ended up there, and sort of what it did for you as a young writer.
Yeah, so Stone Coast is out of the University of Southern Maine. Stone Coast is their Masters of Fine Arts program. It's a low residency program, and when you go into it, it's a graduate program, so you can study fiction, nonfiction, poetry, pop fiction. You can do cross-genre stuff, and
you can tailor it basically to whatever you want.
Yep. Yeah, you can tailor it to whatever you want. And I said it's a low residency. There's low residency, and then there are full residency MFAs. Low residency MFAs are ones where you go twice a year to the campus just for 2 10-day residencies. And you do workshops, and you meet people, and it's fantastic. And then you go home for 5 months wherever you live, and you work one-on-one with a mentor. And it's really tailored to people who might have careers or who have families and can't uproot their lives, but they want to write. And so for me, the program gave me, time to write. I liked the fact that I wasn't on a campus, that I wasn't eating in a dining hall or living in a dorm room. I think I found it much more beneficial for me to build a sense of discipline through, living in an apartment, right, with, my wife and writing, and being in communication intermittently here and there with, a mentor, but always knowing they were there if I needed them. And I think, it was definitely very instrumental. It was there. I worked with the writer Rick Bass and Kara Hoffman and Aaron Hamburger, and they were my mentors, and they still are my mentors and my colleagues. And it was just a transform. I can't speak any higher of the program, I don't think.
Yeah. And now you're also teaching. I know you've taught at that program. I know you teach at UMaine now too, and at a couple other places too. It seems like you're teaching everywhere. As somebody who's still learning too, because I think you are somebody who's always learning and trying to learn and perfect, the craft. How do you balance those two things? Learning more and becoming a better writer yourself, and also like imparting some wisdom on these aspiring writers.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just best. I learned. Actually, when I was at Stone Coast, that the moment you start to get comfortable with your writing is the moment that you're not really writing that well. Unless maybe you're writing like really like genre specific stuff like romance, and you're
cranking it out,
and you're making those millions and millions of dollars. If you're doing, the stuff that doesn't have a formula, you want to feel unsettled. And so the way I balance it is just knowing that I'm going to constantly struggle with every story I approach. And like, that's a normal thing. It doesn't get easier. What gets easier is the feeling of, I think, sometimes fear, right? All the bad emotions we can associate with, failing to write a good story or something. That gets easier to deal with, but just stick with it. That's the biggest thing.
When you were younger and trying to get published in magazines and other places, you must have had some rejection, as all writers do. And there's famous stories of people who saved their rejection letters. I think Stephen King has a whole big thing about saving his rejection letters early on. I certainly heard it from other writers too. And I wonder, how did you handle that? And how did it inform like what you did going forward? Was it fuel? Was it, did you take it really hard? How did that go?
It's interesting is like, I started submitting stories relative, like when I started writing when I was like 18, I started submitting, once I started to have stuff that I thought was, worth it. And, I submitted for 8-9 years before a magazine ever said yes to me. And so I racked up a lot of rejections, but it's funny, you get the first batch you ever send out, you're like, fingers crossed one of these gets picked up, and then none of them do. And you're like, huh, Okay. And you try again, and eventually frustration kicks in, but then finally, then another writer's like, no, that's just how it works. And you're like, oh, okay. And you hear about other people's stories and you're like, okay, I get it. But, yeah, I don't know. I used to, I don't care very much about I know it's part of the process, but I remember, because this was during the online submission stuff. It was still paper in some instances, and I would get like paper rejections from the Paris Review or other places, and it just depended on my mood that day. Sometimes I'd just be like, whatever, and I'd throw it away, and other days I'd be like, F you, and I'll throw it away. And same with the email ones, but it's funny, sometimes you get so excited about one story and you're like, you think they're going to take it, and they've held it for like 6-8 months. And then you like check your email and you see from them, dear Morgan or whatever, dear whatever your name is. Oh my God, you open it and they're just like, sorry, but no, thank you. And then that gets very frustrating. But yeah, it's the whole rejection thing is a wild ride, but I couldn't even tell you how many rejections I've gotten compared to acceptances.
But it didn't deter you, it sounds like. I mean, there was never a point where you got so many rejection letters that you were like, you know what, this isn't for me. I can't do it. I'm not cut out for it. This isn't my path. That clearly never happened.
Yeah, and that was because, what I was doing there was like the business stuff of writing. Like I was a writer, like if you're not getting stuff accepted, that doesn't mean you're not a writer. And like I knew that, or at least I knew it deep down. I would think I was still like, very doubtful and maybe ashamed of not having, of being like, oh, I'm a writer, but I don't have anything published. There's always that weird feeling. But now I know that there's just a clear distinction we have to have as writers, that there's the artistic side, right? And then there's the business side. And when you're writing and when you're creating art, you don't want any of that business emotion to seep in. You don't want to think about where a story might fit in. You don't want to think about who might, like it. You want to think about the story for the story. You can feel all those other emotions when you start thinking about the business stuff, but you got to keep them separate. They're two entirely different things.
I think when we spoke before, you told me that somebody along the way had tried to persuade you that Night of the Living Rez should be a novel and that you should turn it into a novel, and that it wasn't going to work as short stories, and you're crazy to think that it would. Am I capturing that right?
Yeah, it was a number of agents had said, they were like, well, if you could turn this into a novel, we could probably sell it. And I remember trying to turn it into a novel, but the more I tried to impose some overarching plot on it, I felt the story's breaking and the book just didn't work. And it got to the point where I was like, you're not getting a novel out of this, even if it like is broken and you're able to sell it, like you're getting it as it is. And as luck would have it, eventually I found an agent who was able to sell it to Tin House, and then Tin House was able to do their magic.
So is it, extra satisfying them to know that, this is what you wanted to produce? You didn't water it down. You didn't sort of like succumb to the business pressures of of the publishing industry to, turn it to create something that they could sell, but that really wasn't true to you artistically?
Oh yeah, it feels great. Yeah.
Yeah. What other authors are inspiring you right now, and why? And bonus, if they're Maine authors.
Oh, geez, there's a lot of writers I can name. Joseph Hahn's Nuclear Family is a novel I read over the summer. It's just fantastic. There's Jonathan Escoffrey's story collection, If I Survive You, is really, really good. Oh man, there's so many. You put me on the spot here. My brain's overloading with books. What is her name? There is her name's she went to Stone Coast. Shannon Bowring has a book coming out, a novel called The Road to Dalton, which is coming out in June 2023, which I really, really enjoyed. She's a Maine writer, and so I'm excited for that book to come out. I could sit here and flop back and forth, but yeah, I think Joseph Hahn, Nuclear Family, If I Survive You, by Jonathan Escoffery, and Shannon Bowring's novel, The Road to Dalton, June 2023.
Do you think that the success of Night of the Living Rez has sort of maybe given some confidence to other Indigenous writers who may feel like there isn't an audience for their work when there clearly is?
I think so. Yeah, I think I'm a small puzzle in a large puzzle that's going on right now. I think, there are more Indigenous stories being published, and I feel like with each one, we get a broader picture of encouragement in a way. And I'm just happy to have, potentially contributed to that, right? To added my piece to this puzzle that's ongoing. And one day hopefully will be completed.
What are you working on now? Can you share what's next?
I have a novel that Tin House will be publishing in 2024 called Fire Exit. I feel I tell like it hasn't been announced yet, but I feel like everybody knows, or at least like I've said it like over and over again. But the novel, I'm working on edits right now with my editor, and I don't know how close we are to being done with it, but it's pretty close. And so I have that, and then I am working on a sort of like memoir essay collection that has it's sort of like a David Sedaris type book, with just family stories, about my mom, my dad, my sister, and so I'm working on that, and then I am also working on a novel called The Year of the Frog Clan, which focuses on a woman who is trying to regain custody of her children that she's lost for like the 10th time, and she has 1 year to sort of get her act together, and it's like told in multiple perspectives, from her to her sister to her daughters, and it's a cast of Native women, and yeah, we'll see how that goes.
It seems like that's a lot of things all at once. How are you managing this?
I also left some things out because I didn't want to keep going. I'm just sort of picking at it slowly. But my semester ends of teaching ends next week, so we'll be getting back to the page a lot more.
What's your process like? I mean, certainly the teaching, while you're having teaching responsibilities, you probably can't get to sit down in your seat and write the way that you want to. So what kind of discipline do you put on yourself to, maybe it's getting up in the morning, or maybe it's staying up late, or taking time? Like, how do you manage that in addition to having, you still have a job, in addition to this writing?
Yeah. So I just set aside the time. Like, I have to carve the time out of something, and it's usually the early morning is when I do it. If I'm starting out to write a new novel, I'll see it through to the end. Or if I'm starting to write any project, I'll see it through to the end, and I make sure to work on it every day, except Saturday and Sunday, unless I feel completely compelled to do so then. But I just hold myself accountable. I'm like, I have to do it every day. Like, I've learned in the past that if I don't do that, I fall out of it, and I don't complete the project, or I complete it much later. And so I just tell myself, I'm like, okay, you got to do this. You got to do it for this long every day. And I just do it. Sometimes stuff happens where you can't do it, and I don't beat myself up over it. But as long as I know I'm going every day and committing to it, then I feel good.
Did you always have that discipline, or was that something you had to sort of build up over time?
I built it up over time. I think when I was younger, it was more of a touch and go. Like, when I felt really inspired, that's when I would write. And then when I felt uninspired, I was like, well, there's no way I can write. But now I can write without feeling uninspired. I just push through. And it's usually not the best writing, but I'm usually able to find the good writing in it. So it's a practice. It's something you develop, and it's something I'm still developing. And I imagine my process will get much more, will keep changing as I get older, and as I write more, and as I find how I work, because I still feel like I'm always going to be figuring that out. And it's always going to change.
Is there a point where you think you'll give up teaching and do this, on a full-time basis and really devote yourself to it? Or does the teaching kind of keep you, humble in a way, or, give you a little bit of that, creative energy through all these other people who are also, trying to do the thing as well?
I don't know. I don't think I could not do something else. I just feel like I don't know what I would do with myself during the day. Because I don't have, I could write for 8 hours a day, but I would not, that would drain me. That would be like doing an intense workout when you haven't worked out for 10 years or something, and you're just set on the couch for a week after. I've done that before, and it drains you. And so I don't know. I love talking about writing. I love talking about literature. And so I feel like it's probably something that I'd always do in some capacity, whether full-time or, part-time.
All of the things you mentioned before that you're working on and that are coming out, as you were working on them, some of them overlapped with Night of the Living Rez, so maybe this didn't come into your mind, but now that there's been some success and a lot of buzz about this book, does the pressure feel different for you to do it again, or to take it in a different direction, or give people something entirely different? Or do you feel a pressure to, they know me from this, and so I want to give them more of that? Do you have those internal conversations, or is that too much in your head?
I did have that, and then I forgot about it. Thanks for bringing it back up. No, yeah, I did. Yeah, I did. Yes, I did, but I also kind of am I don't. It might feel weird saying this, but I feel like the goal is to always write something better than the last thing you did. But I think in reality, that's not always the case. I think about writing short stories, for example. It's I remember once I wrote a short story that was really good, and I never thought I was going to write a story as good as that one ever again. And then I wrote some duds, and then I wrote one that was better, or that I thought was better, and that others thought were better. Obviously that's a much smaller scale than the novel. So hopefully, I do feel the pressure, and I'm revising, and I'm working, and and obviously I'm a much stronger writer than I am, or than I was, 4 years ago when I was setting out to figure this book out. And so hopefully it's equally as good as this one, if not better.
Is it easier for you to tell when something's good? If you spend a day writing or a few hours writing and you've got 5 pages and you go back and look through what you've written, is it easier for you now to say, yeah, that's pretty good, or that's not very good, I need to throw it away?
Yes and no. I think sometimes you can get in your head about what's good and what's not. But I'm usually I'm pretty hard on myself. So I'm I feel like I run the risk more of calling something bad when it's actually good. I take that approach, which can be kind of problematic, because it's maybe that thing nobody will ever see it, and that is bad. But yeah, no, I have a general sense. I read a lot, not just of my own work, but work for the Massachusetts Review, students' work, published work, galleys of books that are, coming out. And so I'm constantly surrounded by not comparisons, but things that are, similar mechanically. And so I can, I get a sense of how they're working, and I'm able to kind of assess as objectively as possible, I think, if something's good or not.
You talked a bit about the mechanics of writing and studying it, and what works and what doesn't, and how stories unfold, and the magic of it all. I wonder if people out there just think, oh, people just write, they sit down and whatever's in their head comes out on the page, and that's how it works. But it's really not like that. There is a mechanical process involved that you kind of spoke to a little bit. Did you come to that later? You talked about, being interested in stories and storytelling, but the mechanics of it, figuring out how to do it with the tools that you have, was that intuitive as well, or did you kind of have to come to that later?
I don't think it was intuitive. I just know that when I first started to write, like when I was 18 or 19, it was something I deliberately I did like immediately. Like I can't even remember the first craft book I read, but it was like annotate, like read like a writer, like look for these things. And like I just started right from the onset, I started to read that way. And I read a lot of craft books, writers talking about writing and how writing works in certain books. And I was fortunate enough to have, great teachers at Eastern Maine Community College, where I went for 3 years before I went to Dartmouth. And one of the instructors there, he taught by way of using his own work. So he would be like, all right, we're going to write this type of, we're going to write a slice of life vignette. He's like, here's an example. And he would give his own work. And it was great to see, see how it was working and then try to use that as sort of like a template in a way, but also not as a template. And so I from the beginning, I just started developing it because I knew it was an essential skill to have.
Looks like we got about 10 minutes, and I know some people have sent in some questions. So if there are other viewers out there that want to send in questions, we'll see if we can get to as many as we can. So there are a couple people that wanted to know sort of how you decided which stories to include in Night of the Living Rez, and also the order in which they were to appear.
Yeah, so I don't know how many stories I have that are not in the book. Somewhere probably around 35 to 40 stories. And then there's 12 here. So that's a lot of additional stories. So I chose for the collection, I chose what I thought were the 10 best. When I was at Stone Coast, my mentors, told me, they're like, oh, a story collection typically has 10 stories in it. So I was like, all right, I'll choose 10 stories. And, I had David stories and I had D stories. So I was like, all right, well, that works out. I'll have 5 David stories, 5 D stories. And then I realized it didn't work in like a separated way. Like they had to overlap to kind of hide the fact that there was like missing information, this big gap of time. And I remember printing out all the 10 stories and putting them on the floor, 5 of them actually David's. Those were easy to order because those were already chronological. That's how I'd written them. But the D and Phyllis ones weren't. And so I left space in between the stories, and I, almost like a zipper, I would like look for one and be like, all right, this one feels like it would fit here. And I'd put it sort of off kilter with the other one. And I kept doing it until I felt like I had a good order. And then I went back into the book and, revised and edited to make sure it fit that way, and that there were no like contradictions and stuff. And so it was like a very manual process, but also like a heavy sort of like contemplating one as well.
Yeah. And you're jumping back and forth between the two narrators, right? And different time periods and different things like that. But as people come to learn, it's, they're the same narrator. And was that a deliberate choice too, or did that sort of come later, in terms of like letting people sort of figure that out?
I actually tried to make it so the reader didn't know it was T until I think it's in Earth Speak, which is told from D's point of view, but his mom near the end calls him David. And
that's the only real like clue up to that point. Yeah,
that's the only moment that you get like a definitive like David in a D story, I think. But then I realized I was like, okay, the reader's going to figure this out way before, or like some readers will figure this out way before. And so I kind of was like, I'm not going to hide the fact that this is David. Like, I'm just going to write as if the reader already knows that it's them. And so
without drawing attention to it.
Yeah, exactly. And so I did think about it, and I just realized withholding it for 200 pages was not worth the effort. It just wouldn't have paid off in the end.
One of the questions a viewer has, she says, David's mother, grandmother, and his friends' mothers, all the women, they seem to often come through at the end with love, which relieves the trauma of the particular story. But she says, I didn't see any adult men who did the same. Frick tried at times, but his struggles really got in the way. And she says, was this the experience that you meant to convey? Or are there other stories that you sort of are in the works where, they may focus on that masculine side of that particular thing?
Yeah, I was. Thank you for that question. I was really interested in the lack of men, like men figures, and like they're boys, like Dee and David and Fellis, and even Frick to an extent. He's like, they don't know what they're going to become. And I feel like, there's a particular powerlessness that they experience. And, that I don't mean to, imply undercuts, imply that it undercuts, what the women in this book face and what women in the real world face. But there's a sense of like, what is masculinity, right? And it's like, what is it? Like, what does it look like? How should men behave? And like, for me, it was sort of like, I feel like they should behave like how these women behave, like with this sense of love and this compassion and this caring. And it's like that's the missing link, I think, for them. And so it was something I thought about a lot, because it was like, the mother, the grandmother, the sister, Fellis's mom, Beth, like they all invested so much care into their family, but the men really don't. And it has a lot to do with the fact of, I think, being so shut up, you know what I mean? Like so quieted and so locked into a particular type of identity that they're perhaps supposed to convey, right? About what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine.
That was passed down sort of generationally. Like,
yeah,
that's what they saw growing up. That's what they knew. And so they thought they had to also be this thing, even though times evolve, change. It's what they know.
Yeah, exactly. And it's what they know. And I think it's like, it's part of the problem, right? I think, a lot of these incidences would be a lot different if the men had a stronger sense of care and compassion, I think.
Someone wanted to know if you had an example of a book that you weren't able to figure out how the magic was created by the author.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. It makes it sound like I figure out every book. It's not true. I don't know about a book per se, but the short stories by Anton Chekhov have always left me sort of baffled as to how they work. A book I love and am always like enamored by every time I read it is a book called The Lesser Blessed by Richard Van Camp, which I mention, I feel like every time I do an interview, somehow it makes its way in here. But that's a book I can't quite figure out either. It's just very, very good. It's a dark book. I'm sure there are others. I'm gonna have to compile a list called books I can't figure out.
This one wants to know how you came up with the title.
So the first story I ever actually wrote for this collection was the title story, Night of the Living Rez. And I think I just titled it because there was like, in the original version of the story, David comes home and he finds Paige sitting in front of the TV watching a zombie show, or she'd been watching zombie shows throughout the whole story. And I don't know. I think what I was like, what do I call this? Like instantly zombie, Night of the Living Dead, and I was like, oh, Night of the Living Rez, that'll be fun. And so I just threw that in as a title. But then when I was in my MFA program, my mentor, the original title of the book was called The Little Yellow House Stories. Now, who was going to buy that over a book called Night of the Living Rez? Like, that's basically what he said to me. And I was like, all right, I'll change the title. But the title really just came because I thought it was catchy for that short story. And then it ultimately found its way as being the title of the book.
Yeah. Well, it looks like that's all we got for time. Everybody, thanks for the questions you sent along. Morgan, thanks so much for taking the time. This has been wonderful for me, certainly for our listeners as well. I think it's great that you took time to do this, and I think it's great that your book is getting the attention that it is. It's always wonderful when we can see that from Maine authors. So we hope the best for you going forward, and I hope we get a chance to write more about you.
Thank you, Eric. I really appreciate it for having me, and thank you to the Portland Press Herald, and thank you everybody for showing up tonight.